The Philippines is one of the most interesting and overlooked countries in the world. It's currently home to one of the fastest growing economies in history, and it's achieving this very differently from other major players in the region like Thailand, Vietnam, and of course China. This collection of islands is home to 115 million people, which currently make up an overall very poor population with an output roughly a third of the global average, which is especially disappointing considering that the country has some of the greatest natural resource endowments in the region. But exploiting natural resources alone is not enough to make a country rich, and in many cases it can work against it, which is why the Philippines is so interesting. Some strange quirks of the nation's geography, political history, and culture mean that the country is catching up rapidly, and it's doing it in a way that could make it one of the most advanced economies in Asia, right in line with Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan. It's doing this by leveraging its people as much as the resources it can dig out of the dirt. As the Southeast Asian region becomes more divided, the Philippines is becoming a stable and friendly enough country to do a lot of business, make a lot of products, and accommodate a lot of operations that are becoming too complicated to do in China. Of course, that doesn't mean that the country has a clear path to prosperity. It has a very long list of challenges, both internal and external, not least of which is the fact that it's both physically and metaphorically acting as a middleman between the USA and China. Beyond that, ongoing issues like corruption and uncertain political landscape and one of the most crushing forms of inequality a country can have are all immediate challenges that will need to be addressed. It's a lot. And that's before considering that the country's most promising industry may be rendered completely irrelevant by technological developments happening right now. So, what has fueled the Philippines' intense economic growth? Are these industries truly going to be sustainable in the coming decades? And finally, what are the challenges that could undo that progress? Once we've done all of that, we can put the Philippines on the Economics Explained Leaderboard. No matter what kind of work you do, communication is important. Every email, proposal, script or report can speed up or slow down your organisation. This is where our sponsor Grammarly steps in to transform the way that we write and communicate so you can move your work forward. You can save countless hours when you're not struggling to understand what your co-worker has written in an early morning email before your first coffee. Grammarly's AI features can turn that one long, confusing message into a concise sentence so you can avoid yet another unnecessary meeting. The best part is that Grammarly integrates to almost every platform, so it can help you with summarising your co-workers' long messages to concise bullet points in Slack or drafting a quick email in Gmail. And Grammarly takes privacy very seriously, so you don't need to worry about your data being sold to third parties. And if you want to quickly generate something like an outline for a presentation, you can get the AI to plot it all out for you so you can focus more on the substance of your work rather than just facing that blank page. And all these AI features are free. Just sign up using my link at Grammarly.com to download Grammarly for free and start saving time on all your writing today. To say the Philippines has a unique relationship with the USA would be quite the understatement. As much as the US stimulates the Philippines' economy and has provided vital infrastructure, this dependency also opens the East Asian islands up to numerous complications. It started with its colonial history when the USA took over from Spanish rule in 1898. Uprisings throughout the Philippines against Spanish rulers became embroiled in the European countries' war with the USA, and the end result was the Spaniards releasing the colonies to them in exchange for $20 million, a not completely insignificant sum at the time. Despite cries for Filipino independence and resisting guerrilla fighters, the US ultimately voted in favour of using the archipelago as a foothold into Asian trade. That wasn't the explicit reason given at the time, but let's be honest, it's clearly a driving factor. However, to be a competitive trading hub, it required significant investments into infrastructure. This was the turn of the 20th century, when economic prosperity, more than ever, was being determined by mechanisation and modern infrastructure to support industries beyond just agriculture. Sponsorship from the US military began installing hospitals, renovating roads, and funding bridges. One city to see a big overhaul was the capital of Manila. As the first few decades of the 20th century passed, America moulded the Philippines into its image. English became the dominant language, especially in governance and business, and the education system was overhauled to instill American values, even if it potentially came at the cost of its own cultural heritage. Now, of course, the USA wasn't doing this out of the kindness of their heart. Even back then, they saw the strategic importance of these islands, which made them a worthy investment, even if they couldn't claim them forever. After World War II, the US and the Philippines signed the Treaty of Manila on July 4, 1946, whereby the Philippines became an independent republic. Sharing its day of independence with its former ruler, perhaps ironically, sums up how dependent the Philippines actually is on US support. Even to this day, the Philippines' political and economic interests are intertwined with the USA, whether they really like it or not. There is the hotly contested territorial dispute with China over the dominion of the South China Sea, and Japanese business investments have forged a strategic partnership with the Philippine government. This naturally means that any tensions between the Philippines and its neighbours or business partners are felt by the USA and vice versa. If the US has economic disputes with China, like trade routes in the South China Sea for example, then it will also play out in Philippine markets and boardrooms. If Japanese investors try to broker a new deal with the archipelago, then the US will be on hand to intervene at the behest of their former colonies' interests or their own. Yet the Philippines is a sovereign state, so it's expected to incur its own hardships with its own economy. This places the country in a precarious situation, where on one hand they rely on the US both to stimulate its economy and protect its geopolitical interests, while also showing that it's not an American lapdog. That's a tricky identity to navigate when the US personnel stationed in military bases contribute significantly to local business and commerce. Currently, just 500 US military personnel are based in the Philippines, but there are more bases due to be built in the near future, and the US pays handsomely for this foothold. Once the cost for salaries and benefits of Americans stationed overseas are factored in, then this practically becomes a form of indirect foreign aid because the US is indirectly sending money to the Philippines through their troops. Clearly, the Philippines has a complicated relationship with the United States of America at all levels of its economy. The big question is whether this entanglement is a gift or a curse, especially when the Philippines is used as a major hub for outsourcing, including by one of the world's biggest employers that most people have never heard of. It's called Accenture, and it's a self-described US multinational headquartered in Dublin, for reasons obviously not tax-related. According to Fortune magazine, its revenues in 2023 were an impressive $64.1 billion, and that's thanks to having 91 of the Fortune Global 100 companies amongst its client base. The company has 733,000 employees, with offices and operations in more than 200 cities across 49 countries, where it serves clients in more than 120 economies around the world. A big part of the company's operations are simple professional services provided by low-cost employees from countries where labour is much cheaper than the advanced economies it works for. Accenture has targeted the Philippines because of the nation's unique physical and political position, but above all else, its cultural history. For starters, Filipino workers are far more than just low-cost labourers. There are knowledge-based fields on offer like back-office work, call centres, and even creative fields like basic marketing and design. Such diverse opportunities help businesses find the most optimal cost-saving structure, so even if they're not manufacturers looking to fill overseas factories with cheap assembly workers, there's a lot of heavy lifting that can be done for them at a far lower cost in the Philippines. The likes of Amazon, American Express, Apple, Google, and even Wells Fargo firmly integrate the Philippines into their business structure. That means tens of billions of dollars have been generated thanks to the low-cost workforce of this country. But the question is, why? There are plenty of other, more competitive countries within a stone's throw, like China, Thailand, and even India, which has more English speakers than the Philippines has people. Yet, major global companies still choose here. The answer is simple but unintuitive. Decades of Western education, cultural influence, and work training means Filipinos can connect with Western clients in ways other Asian workers might not be able to. The high standards and regulatory practices also make them far more dependable, meanwhile the lower costs of labour outcompetes the workers from Western countries with similar features. Plus, there are the security concerns. Western companies are more inclined to hand over sensitive documents to Accenture or any other firm operating within the area than with their Chinese counterparts. Even India, another outsourcing hub, has had enough scandals and leaks within recent years to lose credibility in the eyes of potential business partners. In 2019, the telecommunications company T-Mobile sued Chinese manufacturer Huawei for stealing its technology through an Indian subcontractor. According to the US Department of Justice report, Huawei offered bonuses to workers to steal confidential information for companies around the world, and was even indicted for wire fraud and obstruction of justice. That same year also saw Wipro, one of the largest IT companies in all of India, fall victim to a devastating data breach. Allegedly, a nation-state actor accessed their systems months before they realised their servers had been compromised, and it's not just private businesses having issues like these. States and public bodies are regretting outsourcing their tax dollar-funded projects. The state of Nebraska sued Wipro for failing to deliver on a $6 million upgrade to a healthcare network, and the US National Grid came after Wipro for their botched SAP upgrade. Apparently, the cost to undo the damage Wipro caused was more than the cost of what they would have saved in the first place. In the end, the Indian firm was sued for $75 million. Concerns over lax regulatory practices and questionable attitudes to IP theft are partially why the United States has blacklisted major companies from both India and China for this kind of tech outsourcing. For any economy relying on their outsourcing industry to stabilise its GDP, that's a death blow. While these bans may have also had geopolitical motivations, they are a fantastic opportunity for an economy like the Philippines, which doesn't need to be perfect, it just needs to be the least bad option. Western customs and strong regulatory practices aside, there is one more unique reason why the Philippines is so sought after. Its unique geography plays a huge part in its outsourcing success. Unfortunately, this factor also contributes to its industrial stagnation. Being a series of islands with a small landmass means the Philippines is immediately restricted with the services it can offer. Infrastructure connecting the islands is limited, or in some places, it's just non-existent. Physically developing areas and industries becomes a real and consistent challenge. Lack of usable land also means manufacturing and transportation were never going to be the country's forte. On the plus side, an immediate benefit from this is not having to directly compete with China's manufacturing-based economy. This naturally inclines the Philippines into more white-collar services, where available land can be dedicated to building offices and studios, rather than plants processing materials and harvesting resources. Having a niche to carve out can be a good problem to have, but everything in economics is a trade-off. The Philippines imports more than it exports to the tune of around a $57 billion deficit a year. That is a huge trade gap to fill for an economy of this size. Even if it had a more robust manufacturing sector, it would need to source revenue elsewhere. Sure, some money comes from services to overseas clients, and there are remittances, that's when Philippine nationals working abroad send money back home, but these steady streams aren't going to be enough to stabilise the economy. There needs to be another, more reliable way to close the trade gap. Shipbuilding has been a promising growth industry. The country doesn't have the industrial capacity to compete with the mega shipyards of Japan, China and South Korea, but instead of making a few mega ships, it has built a more reliable industry producing smaller, less impressive vessels. Due to its geography, fleets of smaller cargo ships and ferries are already operating across the archipelago, so the country has a long history of dealing with these more basic vessels. For every 20,000 TEU cargo ship demanded by the world's largest shipping companies, there are thousands of ferries and basic freighters crossing the world's oceans. This strategy of doing basic things and doing a lot of it has really been the driver of the growth the Philippines has experienced over the last 2 decades. It might sound mean to call an economy aggressively mid, but that's really been its strength. Basic services and basic shipbuilding are just the start too. Take their technology sector. It focuses on small, valuable components like basic microchip production. Sure, it's not as lucrative as the high-end processor market, and the Philippines tech sector is certainly overshadowed by Taiwan, but that's assuming that the Philippines needs to operate in the same business at all. In reality, basic microchips are in high demand. For every iPhone or gaming rig a person needs, there'll be dozens of other items in their homes running simpler hardware with simpler chips and components. The trade-off here is that though the upper levels of these billion-dollar industries are out of reach, the Philippines excels at mid-tier operations. Put their basic microchips, basic shipbuilding, basic consulting, and basic electronics together, and you've got a pretty formidable hold on middle-of-the-road enterprises. The profits may be low, but so are the costs. Taking the middle of the road will only work up to a point though. The world's leading advanced economies don't get there by harbouring basic industries. It can be a springboard, but if the Philippines wants to break into the global middle class, it's going to have to upscale at least some of these industries. Now, that is certainly possible. As we've already explored, it has a talented workforce and good global connections. But other forces are at play that could threaten economic stability more than a competitive market. Corruption in the Philippines is an open secret. It's so deeply entrenched across many levels of government and business that it stunts economic growth from the get-go. Everything from the misuse of public spending to good old-fashioned kickbacks and bribes. Domestic industries and local businesses are less likely to receive funding from the country's government, which already has a history of eroding public trust. In 2021, a prominent anti-corruption journalist was shot outside his home in what was a clear message to those wishing to hold their government to account. Despite having a prolific radio show outing bent officials, the alleged real mastermind behind the assassination has not been charged. Instead, the self-confessed gunman, who many believe was a fall guy, has been sentenced to just 16 years. This is a pretty lenient sentence given the Philippines' tough justice system. Possession of drugs in the Philippines frequently gets life imprisonment or the death penalty by comparison. In 2023, the Corruption Perception Index ranked the Philippines 115th out of 180 countries. Even without the risk of holding corrupt governments to account, navigating red tape is enough to deter most Filipinos from setting up their own enterprises. Outsiders are just as cautious, preferring to do things at an arm's length, which means it won't have the people willing to take the risks necessary to advance its industries, given the inherent sovereign risks that already come with the country. Uncertainty is an investor repellent. The Philippines may offer a young workforce and an industry specialism with a strategic location, but the chance of political instability caps any confidence an outside investor may have. However, that is assuming that they are motivated purely by economic returns. The Philippines president, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., the junior of that Ferdinand Marcos who was run out of his own country, has said deepened ties with the USA and Japan would see a $100 billion investment. This could be enough of a cash injection to improve their reputation. He has claimed he wants to transform his country into a manufacturing and logistic hub. Such an ambitious project could be what's needed to streamline business legislation and stamp out officials driven by self-interest. To America, the timing is perfect. Tensions in the South China Sea demand fewer China and Taiwan-centric supply chains. But to some nationals, this potential injection of capital will only exacerbate the already terrible inequality the country deals with. And they have a point. You can't stop politicians lining their own pockets by giving them more money. Only a few islands are truly developed, and that depends highly on how close they are to the major islands that get a majority of the economic attention. Other times a province or a city has a high GDP per capita because of tourism, agriculture and fisheries, but the point is, inequality in the Philippines is inherent in its geography and exacerbated by questionable governance. Manila, for example, is the most densely populated city in the world, with a per capita income more than 10 times higher than the remote islands. It's been rising at such a steady rate that things are unlikely to even out in the future. Compare that to the living conditions of the remote islands, where a majority of people still live in absolute poverty. This disparity denies talented workers from impoverished areas a real shot of making it in the outsourced labour market. But must-live places like Manila are simply too expensive to uproot to. Ultimately, the possibility of upward social mobility is slimmer for anyone without a connection to the capital. Unfortunately, real living conditions are not much better for people in the big cities either. Some workers can mitigate these costs by living outside Manila, sure, yet the vast urban sprawl has contributed to terrible living conditions with basic amenities failing to keep up. Between 2000 and 2014 alone, 14,059 hectares of built-up area were haphazardly added to the city. Not only do these issues limit the growth of a labour base, it incentivises talented workers to leave. Most developing economies have a brain drain problem, but in the Philippines it's particularly acute because of the same language and cultural skills that made the country so competitive in the first place. This is all happening at a time where the country can least afford to lose its most talented, because it's in something of a race against the clock to become more advanced before it's made irrelevant by new technology. Analysts predict the sectors to be most hit by AI will include things like back office, customer service, call centres, warehouse, administration and logistics management. In other words, all of the areas the Philippines specialises in as part of its outsourcing niche. Okay, now it's time to put the Philippines on the Economics Explained Leaderboard. Starting as always with size, the Philippines has a GDP of $471 billion, making it the 32nd largest economy in the world, just behind Singapore and just ahead of Vietnam, two other equally dynamic economies in the same region that have achieved their economic scale in remarkably different ways. This gives the Philippines a 7 out of 10. That very respectable GDP is, however, spread out over a large population of 115 million people, which means the country has a GDP per capita of just $4,130, which, despite sustained growth over the previous years, is still well below the global average of $13,000. So the country gets a 3 out of 10. Stability and confidence is an interesting one. It has a level of national security thanks to its unique relationship with the USA, but that is quite literally a double-edged sword which could open the country up to the complications we explored in this video. Beyond that, domestic issues like corruption and political tensions mean the country can only get a 5 out of 10. Growth has clearly been very strong. The country has grown out a unique set of local industries and capitalised on the talents of its large workforce. The country has almost doubled its output over the last decade, so it gets a 9 out of 10. Finally, industry. The country is not world-leading at anything in particular, but there is something to be said for being average in a lot of average industries. Even still, with a threat of AI, a reliance on foreign transfers, and very few local homegrown companies, the Philippines can only get a 6 out of 10. Altogether, that gives the country an average score of 6 out of 10, a healthy but middle-of-the-road score, which has in many ways been the theme of this economy. Now, last year we made a video on Indonesia, an economy that on the surface looks very similar to the Philippines, but is achieving its record-breaking growth in its own unique way. You should be able to click to that video on your screen now. Thanks for watching, mate. Bye.